There are names that have never been dragged through the headlines. But in the black showbiz backstage of the 80s and 90s, everyone knew, don't mess with Teddy Pendergrass, not even with the wrong kind of glance. Patti LaBelle witnessed it many times. Just one joke, one light touch after prayer, one careless whisper from a dancer. That was enough for Teddy to walk out, refuse to sing, and get someone cut from the lineup overnight. According to Patti, who was by Teddy's side through the 80s, there were 6 gay artists who made Teddy so angry he never forgave them. Who were they? What did they say or do to get crossed off by Teddy, some even disappearing from the stage for good? Let's start with the first name on this list. You won't believe your ears. There was one thing that the black music scene in 1980s America whispered about, but never dared say out loud. A quiet, drawn-out, almost cursed kind of feud between 2 men once seen as the soul of R&B. One was a blazing sex symbol, singing like he was demanding love through the body. The other lived in the shadows, soft, sorrowful, always hiding his loneliness behind an elegant suit. That was Teddy Pendergrass and Luther Vandross, 2 worlds that couldn't mix. One night in June 1987, inside a narrow elevator at the Apollo Theater, those 2 worlds nearly collided in fists. That night, June 15th, hundreds of artists and fans gathered in Harlem to honor Marvin Gaye. The Apollo was filled with flowers, tears, perfume, and soulful melancholy. But after the lights dimmed, the show ended and the crowd thinned out. A moment happened between Luther and Teddy that was never recorded in any official history. A moment only known by insiders or those who'd been around long enough to whisper about it. Since the late 1970s, Luther had stood out with his refined voice and the ability to move people emotionally like an invisible conductor. But he was never a man of the real world, the world where black male artists were expected to be strong, straight, married, and always surrounded by women. Luther quietly lived a life with no love scandals, no paparazzi, and no appearances with any woman. But that silence only fueled the rumors. Backstage stories claimed that Luther once paid to hush up a same-sex harassment case filed by a young assistant in Los Angeles in 1982. A former bandmate confirmed that Luther had a long, complicated relationship with a male member of the Dramatics. And many swore he was obsessed with dominant black men, the name that came up most often being Teddy Pendergrass. Teddy, with his muscular build, raspy, seductive voice, and full-throttle manhood, was Luther's unreachable dream. A former production assistant on the 1985 Atlantic tour said Luther had a habit of watching Teddy too closely, for too long, making others on the team uncomfortable. Once backstage, after Teddy stepped out of his dressing room wearing nothing but a towel. Luther stared so hard he had to be pulled away. That wasn't admiration anymore, that was fixation, the assistant concluded. At the same time, Atlantic Records had floated the idea of a duet album between Luther and Teddy, hoping for a modern-day Marvin Gaye, Tammy Terrell pairing. But the plan was quickly scrapped after Teddy flat-out refused. "I don't record with people like that?" The words spread internally like a cold knife. From then on, the 2 avoided each other completely. No sharing the stage, no appearing in the same photo, not even a glance exchanged. But the wound kept quietly bleeding. On the night of June 15, 1987, after the Marvin Gaye tribute show ended, Luther and Teddy happened to step into the same cramped elevator at the Apollo, along with 3 others. It was tight, the air heavy, and the smell of Teddy's leather jacket filled the space. According to one witness, Luther made a small comment about the scent and a night in Paris. The words seemed harmless, but they lit a fuse buried too long. Teddy stayed silent, his eyes sharp as blades. When the doors opened, he stepped out first, then immediately turned, arm raised, charging toward Luther. If Patti LaBelle hadn't grabbed Teddy's arm in that split second, Luther might have taken a punch to the face. Right there, at an event meant to honor Marvin Gaye. Everyone present said Teddy's eyes weren't angry. They were filled with pure disgust, like he was looking at something filthy. No apology, no second meeting. After the incident, Luther left early. He sat in his car for nearly 30 minutes, alone, no music, no words, just staring into the darkness ahead. Years later, when asked why he'd never done a duet with Teddy, Luther simply smiled and said vaguely, "Some people, just being near them can burn you up." From 1990 onward, Luther almost completely disappeared from any event where Teddy might show up. Silence became his armor. But according to longtime friend, singer Fonzie Thornton, Luther carried that wound for the rest of his life. The look of contempt, the held-back punch, the public rejection, and the music world where soft men like him were never allowed to exist fully. Luther Vandross passed away in 2005. No family, no children, no public partner, just millions of tender love songs left behind for the world, a world he never truly belonged to. On the misty morning of April 5, 1983, the West Angeles Church of God in Christ in south-central Los Angeles was surrounded by rows of black limousines and crowds dressed in mourning attire. Inside the church, famous faces from the black music scene appeared cold, hiding behind dark sunglasses and sorrowful gazes. Marvin Gaye had been shot dead by his father just 3 days earlier, and this was the AIA unofficial national memorial service for the soul of soul music. But amidst the hymns, the praises for the soul of the departed, there was a moment as cold as steel slicing through the sacred air. A moment that was never captured on film, never reported in the press, but became one of the darkest memories in the minds of anyone who witnessed it. The moment Teddy Pendergrass refused to shake Billy Preston's hand. At that time, Billy Preston was no stranger to the public. He had played keyboard for both the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, the only black man present in the studio when Let It Be was recorded. He was called the Fifth Beatle, a genius on the Hammond B3, and had won a Grammy in 1973. But that illustrious career was always tainted by shadows that could never be erased. In 1977, Billy was arrested at a motel in Venice Beach for disturbing the peace, but leaked police records later revealed that he had been caught in the act with a teenage male. The incident was buried by the media, but within the music industry, everyone knew. That was why, after 1980, Billy appeared almost exclusively in religious shows, charity events, and low-profile music projects. Teddy Pendergrass was one of the few artists who performed with Billy during these times. The two shared the stage at an NAACP charity event in Atlanta in 1981, but there was never any closeness between them. Behind the scenes, Teddy kept a clear distance, never sitting close, never shaking hands, always instructing his assistants to keep personal space. According to a member of the show's crew, once, after a party following an event, when Billy was drunk, he pointed at Teddy and said half-jokingly, "That gospel boy is the only one I'd pay to touch." The comment froze the air. No one mentioned it again. But from that point onward, Teddy kept an even greater distance. For him, it wasn't just an insulting remark, it was sacrilege. The Marvin Gaye memorial service started at 10 a.m. Under the white dome of the church, the casket was placed at the center, a symbol of sacrifice. Older black artists like Smokey Robinson, Gladys Knight, and Dionne Warwick sat in the front row. Billy arrived late. When he entered the church, his afro hair streaked with gray, his long black robe making him look more like a tired preacher than a star. He said little, only bowing his head as he quietly stood at the back of the sanctuary. But when the service ended and people began leaving, he took action. Amidst dozens of people hugging and comforting each other, Billy walked straight toward Teddy. He moved through a line of artists, weaving through astonished gazes, and stopped in front of Teddy. Without hesitation, he extended his hand, palm open, as if in a gesture of reverence. And then he spoke, his voice deep, hoarse, still trembling from emotion. "You know, your voice is the only thing that makes me believe angels can dwell in men." Everyone around them fell silent. Teddy looked down at the outstretched hand. He didn't say a word. He pulled a tissue from his pocket and wiped his hand right in front of Billy, each motion deliberate, as if cleaning off something filthy. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Billy standing alone in the churchyard, his hand still open, his face expressionless, but his eyes darkened like ash. No one said a word. No one laughed. No one stood by Billy's side. That rejection, simple, cold, and without words, carried more weight than a punch. After the service, Billy left alone. He was seen sitting in his car for a long time before starting the engine. A security guard later claimed that he had cried. The tears were silent, falling quietly onto his robe. No one asked, no one comforted him, because they knew nothing could soothe the tear that had just ripped through the heart of the man once hailed as a genius. Teddy never spoke of the incident again. In a 1985 interview, when asked about artists he felt were spiritually incompatible, he only gave a vague response. "Some people call my voice angelic, but they don't understand that angels can be angry too." That statement wasn't aimed at anyone in particular, but those who witnessed the memorial that day understood exactly. Teddy's hatred toward Billy wasn't born out of jealousy for his talent. It came from something deeper, darker, the feeling of being humiliated in a sacred space, a place where only forgiveness should exist. But for Teddy, Billy's handshake wasn't a condolence. It was sacrilege, a man with a tainted sexual reputation, once caught in the act, openly desiring him, daring to call him a dwelling place for angels. Billy Preston continued living in the years that followed, with small performance contracts, gospel TV shows, and stints in rehab centers. He passed away in 2006 from complications due to high blood pressure and kidney failure, leaving behind a vast musical legacy, but one overshadowed by a past that no one wanted to uncover. For those who witnessed the 1983 memorial, that rejected handshake wasn't just a cold act. It was a verdict. And from that day forward, no one dared to call Teddy Pendergrass an angel anymore. Jermaine Stewart stepped into the 1980s with a strange declaration. "We don't have to take our clothes off to have a good time." A lyric that sounded innocent on the surface, yet held a deep melancholy only those living on the fringe could truly understand. In an R&B era overflowing with testosterone, Jermaine stood out like a sore thumb. He wore chiffon, sported long hair, soft makeup, and danced with such fluidity that gender lines blurred into oblivion. He never openly identified as gay. But male dancers who shared homes with him in London, the rumors of secret midnight dancer auditions, and those longing stares backstage, all turned him into one of the most whispered-about artists in the black music scene of the 80s. Few people know Jermaine once shared a management roster with Teddy Pendergrass in the early part of the decade. Back then, he was just a backup dancer for Shalimar, while Teddy had already taken the throne as the new king of modern soul. No one recalls them ever speaking. But one employee from the company remembered Jermaine would ask detailed questions about Teddy. He wanted to know his habits, preferences, speech patterns, how he walked. Not out of artistic admiration, but as if he was trying to write a script in his head. And eventually, he did. On the night of July 16, 1988, during the Studio 54 revival party in New York, an iconic event celebrating the rebirth of disco spirit, where drag queens, bisexual artists, queers, and the underground flooded the stage like a tidal wave. One surprise act froze the entire crowd. At the peak of the night, a drag queen named Luscious Simone took the stage dressed in a Teddy impersonation, black leather jacket, gloves, sunglasses. She grabbed the mic, opened a notebook, and started to read. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a tribute to Marvin Gaye, as many expected. It was a piece of fan fiction written by Jermaine Stewart himself and shared among close friends as a private joke. That night, it was brought to the stage. The story described Jermaine and Teddy getting stuck in a hotel elevator in Chicago back in 1983. What started as tension and bickering in the heat, sweat, breathing, glances, turned into a sudden kiss and spiraled into something no one expected. The room erupted in laughter. Some artists clapped, but a few pulled out their phones, recorded the scene, and by the next morning had already contacted Teddy's assistant. When the recording was played back at Teddy's management office in Philadelphia, the atmosphere in the room collapsed into a chilling silence. One employee recalled, when the line, "As his hand moved down to my waist," came on, Teddy put his glass down, stood up, walked out, and didn't say a word for 12 minutes. Then he came back in and with a clenched tone told his assistant, "I don't accept my name being dragged into that kind of garbage." He then ordered immediate action. Contact the organizers, send legal documents, demand removal of the entire performance, and ban any use of his name, image, or any implied reference to Teddy Pendergrass in such stage productions. It was no longer a joke. To Teddy, it was image abuse. A man who once shared the same company, who'd been dropped from a charity recording lineup for not being mainstream enough, now had the audacity to turn him into the object of an erotic performance in front of a cheering crowd in the heart of New York. The imagination had gone beyond admiration. It had become violation, and Teddy would not forgive it. The event organizers apologized immediately. The drag queen was banned from the following nights. But Germain gave no response. He disappeared from the media radar for 3 weeks. When he finally resurfaced in a Brooklyn radio interview and was asked if he wrote the fan fiction, Germain just laughed and said, "I don't write fan fiction, but if anyone thinks I'd want to be stuck in an elevator with Teddy Pendergrass, at least my taste is fire." A half joke, and it became the final blow. Teddy cut all ties with Germain. He declined BET events where Germain's name appeared. He refused to record for Quincy Jones's tribute show in 1989 just because Germain was part of the dance crew. To Teddy, Germain was no longer an artist. He was a blasphemer, a man who toyed with the honor of black manhood in a world that never allowed gay men to exist without scrutiny. Germain, from the peak of "We Don't Have to Take Our Clothes Off," began a freefall. His next album flopped. U.S. shows were canceled in waves. He pulled back to the German market, then moved to Switzerland, living in near silence. By 1993, rumors of his HIV diagnosis began to circulate. Germain didn't confirm, didn't deny. In 1997, he passed away in Homewood, Illinois, at age 39, in a nursing facility for AIDS patients. People no longer remember Germain Stewart as one of funk pop's defining voices. They remember him as someone who wrote the wrong story. A small tale, meant to be funny, became the blade that cracked the fragile line between imagination and dignity. And to Teddy, the man who dared turn him into a character in a sexual story, even just for one night, would never have a place in the real world. Sometimes just a casual backstage comment can make a star lose their mind and ruin any chance of collaboration in the future. Especially when that comment comes from the dancer of a white singer aimed directly at a black sex symbol like Teddy Pendergrass. Especially when it's about sex. And especially when the name mentioned is George Michael. In October 1989, Atlanta was curled up in the dry chill of late fall, but inside the Fox Theater, the air was burning hot. It was the night of the BET Soul Awards, a celebration of the most influential black artists of the year. On stage, names like Patti LaBelle, Whitney Houston, and New Edition owned the spotlight. But off stage, in a quiet corner behind the curtain, an invisible collision was brewing between two worlds that weren't supposed to touch, George Michael and Teddy Pendergrass. George, just past 30, was an international superstar after the global success of Faith, 1987. The image of him swaying in a leather jacket in the desert to I Want Your Sex had stunned the world. But behind that glow, George was full of contradictions. He wasn't out as gay, but his melodies, glances, and lyrics were heavy with repressed desire, especially for black men. No one forgot his tender duet with Aretha Franklin in I Knew You Were Waiting, or the times he mentioned Stevie Wonder and Donny Hathaway as part of his childhood dream. Teddy Pendergrass, on the other hand, was the living embodiment of that dream. Male, black, sensual, a voice like torn velvet, radiating dominance. He wasn't just a musical figure. For someone like George, he was the embodiment of a forbidden yearning. Ironically, that night at the Soul Awards, both George and Teddy were invited to perform and be honored. George's presence was surprising. He was one of the rare white artists at an event dedicated to black musicians. But he'd had a hit with Aretha and was preparing a new project steeped in American soul and funk. He came with warmth and goodwill. Then, just hours before the show began, a backstage whisper burned everything down. A young dancer in George's troupe, believed to be his unofficial lover, approached Teddy in the makeup area. He whispered, just loud enough for Teddy to hear, "You know, George says you're the reason he never married a woman." There was no laughter, no teasing look, just a dry statement, but it cut deep like a knife into Teddy's male pride. Teddy didn't respond. He turned away, silent, but immediately requested the event organizers to separate the men's dressing rooms. In the internal guest list for BET that year, there's a handwritten note. TP requests a separate room to avoid unnecessary interactions. No one asked, no one dared to ask, but the entire crew could feel the tension in the air from that moment on. The show began. Everything outside was still bathed in bright lights. George performed "One More Try," sitting alone on stage with only the soft sound of a keyboard behind him. In the VIP section, Teddy didn't look up. The entire performance felt as though there was an invisible wall separating the two stars. One side was burning with unspoken desire, the other was coldly defensive. After the show, George, with typical British politeness, approached Teddy to greet him. He extended his hand, offering a polite smile, and was about to thank him for attending. But Teddy didn't respond. He turned his face away, his voice dropping into a warning, "Don't make me angry here." The atmosphere froze. George stood still for a few seconds before slowly retracting his hand. No one said anything further. No one tried to resolve the tension. Those who witnessed it later recalled that it was one of the heaviest moments in the BET backstage. George left early. Teddy, throughout the rest of the party, didn't mention it again. But everyone understood. The boundary had been crossed. The seemingly harmless comment from the dancer, a whispered remark that seemed playful, had actually forced Teddy into the role of the object of desire. In a culture where black masculinity is always under scrutiny and pressure to conform, being made into a sexual icon for a white gay man was not a compliment. For Teddy, it was a covert humiliation, a quiet yet profound invasion. And tragically, 9 years later, George was arrested in a Beverly Hills public restroom for soliciting sex. The media exposed it, flashbulbs went off, and he was forced to publicly come out as gay. But no one brought up the Atlanta incident, no one mentioned the backstage BET story, where perhaps George had revealed a much deeper truth than any criminal headline could capture. Teddy never spoke of it again, but according to a close friend in the industry, from that night on, he banned any collaboration with the name George Michael. Some producers who had suggested remixing "Close the Door" in a new funk style, with George singing the chorus, were flatly rejected. The reason given was always spiritually incompatible. The truth is, no one wants to be turned into someone else's wet dream, especially when that dream is whispered in their ear in the most sacred place of an artist's pride, the backstage. For George Michael, it was just a romantic quote. For Teddy Pendergrass, it was a line crossed. Some scandals never make it to the press, but they're powerful enough to end an entire career. And in the world of black artists in the 80s, where the line between the soul of music and a dirty personal life is drawn with a razor, just one misplaced rumor, one wrong glance, or one hug with the wrong person can erase you from every stage poster. David Peaston understood this, but he understood it too late. David was a rare light in the American gospel scene in the late 80s. Born into a family from Missouri, with his mother being gospel singer Martha Bass, David had a tenor voice that could cut through an entire choir. He wasn't handsome, nor was he sexually alluring, but when he stood on stage, his face would light up and his eyes would close when he hit the high notes, sending chills through the audience. He won Showtime at the Apollo, was invited to sing with Natalie Cole, and was hailed by critics as the one who brought the soul back to gospel in the age of electronic music. But the closer he got to the spotlight, the longer the shadow behind him grew. Rumors began circulating in 1988 when David joined the Gospel All-Stars tour across the southern United States. A dancer later recounted in an interview cut from the broadcast that he had seen David in the dressing room at midnight, wearing a deep purple velvet robe, holding a young lighting technician, the two of them forehead to forehead, whispering between the unturned-off speakers. The scene unfolded in the prayer room, a space meant only for hymns, Bible readings, and prayers before the performance. The incident went unspoken, but followed David like a shadow. In 1989, David was invited to join the Soul Revival Nights Tour, a series of shows blending R&B, gospel, and soul in major venues like the Apollo, Fox, and Chicago Theater. It was a rare opportunity for David to share the stage with stars like Patti LaBelle, Luther Ingram, and Teddy Pendergrass. But from the very beginning, the atmosphere between David and Teddy was cold. Teddy avoided looking David in the eye. No photos together, no handshakes after rehearsals. According to a backstage staff member, Teddy had told the organizers, "Don't make me share a dressing room with that guy." What had made Teddy so wary? On the night of October 14, 1989, the tour stopped at the Chicago Theater, one of the biggest highlights. Backstage was cramped, with many crews sharing portable toilets outside to change clothes, do makeup, and rest between sets. Around 9:30 p.m., a lighting technician rushed to Teddy's assistant and whispered in his ear, "David is hugging a sound technician in the blue bathroom." The words spread like wildfire. Though there was no proof, no one filmed it, it was enough to make Teddy furious. On the way back to the hotel, as the van rolled down Michigan Avenue, Teddy sat in the back, staring out the window, and coldly muttered, "I don't preach with people who sneak around in God's room." No one in the van dared respond. The next day, the Milwaukee show's poster was reprinted overnight. David Peaston's name was scratched off the lineup. No announcement, no explanation. He simply wasn't called to the rehearsal, and the crew van didn't pick him up from the hotel. The tour representative simply said, "The schedule changed." But everyone understood. It was over. For David, that blow didn't come from the audience or the media. It came from within the artist community. A black gay gospel singer kicked off a tour just because he hugged the wrong person in a space considered sacred. No one publicly called him gay, no one wrote an exposé, but everyone stayed silent in just the right way for him to disappear without a word. Later, David tried to make a comeback. He released a solo album, Mixed Emotions, in 1991, but it didn't gain much attention. Traditional gospel labels refused to sign long-term contracts. He toured small churches in the Midwest, shifted to teaching music, and made a brief reappearance in 1994 on a cable TV show. But the bright stage lights never called his name again. By the late 90s, David began facing health problems. His weight skyrocketed. He was diagnosed with severe diabetes. In 2004, he had to amputate a leg. In 2012, David Peaston passed away at 54 due to complications from diabetes in St. Louis, his hometown where a few still remembered his voice. There was no grand memorial, no tribute show, just a small mention in the back pages of Jet magazine, referring to him as the gospel singer who briefly made waves in the late 80s. The hug in the blue bathroom in 1989 was never mentioned again, but it was the moment that ended it all, written in the shadows, with a Eda's wordless judgment. For Teddy, David was someone who didn't deserve to sing gospel if he couldn't keep himself clean. But for David, perhaps the only thing he ever did wrong was not hug the right person in the right place. The most frightening thing isn't the one who commits the crime, but the one who covers it up with preaching. For Teddy Pendergrass, Clifton Davis was exactly that kind of person. Clifton Davis was one of the rare faces who stood on both Hollywood stages and church pulpits. In the early 70s, he wrote the timeless song Never Can Say Goodbye for the Jackson 5 when he was just over 20 years old. Later, he became a famous TV actor, playing the role of Pastor Reuben Gregory in the sitcom Amen, which ran from 1986 to 1991. With his neatly combed hair, perfect voice, and impeccable moral image, Clifton was seen as the ideal black man in the eyes of the public, polite, clean, and devout. But not everyone believed that polished image. After transitioning into preaching, Clifton maintained his public persona. He traveled across the U.S., speaking at large church conferences, appearing on CBN and Trinity Broadcasting Network, preaching about love, forgiveness, and a life led by God. Yet within the black church community, whispers began to spread from the late 80s. A young pastor from Nashville, anonymous in a 1991 confidential confession, recounted one night after a summer seminar, he was invited to stay and pray privately with Clifton after everyone else had left. In a dimly lit room with golden lighting, they both kneeled, their hands touching. Then Clifton placed his hand on his cheek and whispered a prayer. May God open the path for those who carry hidden burdens. No one called it sexual, but the pastor wrote, I felt like my soul was touched in a way I was never prepared for. The article didn't name anyone, but the details, the event, the location, the time, all matched Clifton's preaching schedule. From there, more similar rumors surfaced. A CBN television staff member once revealed that Clifton always spent private prayer time with young men after the broadcast, often requesting no third parties. A youth group leader from a church in Baltimore mentioned that he once saw Clifton hugging a man in the prayer room when he accidentally opened the door at the wrong time. No one dared to report it. No one had solid evidence. But in a world where pastors are expected to maintain absolute morality, those rumors were enough to make Teddy Pendergrass feel repulsed. Teddy was once invited to appear on a faith-based television show hosted by Clifton in 1992. However, he declined. Teddy's assistant said the reason was a packed schedule. But according to a producer on the show, Teddy openly told the inviter, I don't want to share a stage with anyone who uses the Bible to hide what they're afraid to. Live honestly. That wasn't a criticism. It was a verdict. In April 1993, at the Gospel and Brotherhood Seminar in Atlanta, Clifton was the guest of honor, delivering the keynote speech to 800 attendees, including artists, pastors, and church members from across the southeastern U.S. In his 20-minute speech, Clifton spoke about God's love for those struggling with inner secrets. He didn't specify what the secrets were, but many understood he was talking about sexuality. Teddy sat in the front row. As soon as he heard the phrase, God understands those who can't speak their truth, he turned to Patti LaBelle, tilted his head, and whispered, Don't use the Bible to cover up sin. Some people around them heard clearly. Patti held Teddy's hand as if to prevent him from reacting more strongly. The atmosphere in the auditorium became tense. But the most memorable moment hadn't come yet. After the speech, the MC announced a special performance. For the first time, Clifton Davis and Teddy Pendergrass would sing the hymn, Walk in the Light, together. The audience clapped. The lights dimmed. Clifton smiled and extended his hand to invite Teddy up. But Teddy didn't stand up. When asked a second time, he slowly rose, but didn't move to the stage. He turned, walked straight to the wings, without saying a word. Clifton stood still, his hand still outstretched in the middle of the stage. A few coughs echoed through the room. The MC quickly moved to the next segment. After that, no one mentioned what had happened, but everyone knew. After the event, Teddy never accepted any invitation related to Clifton. He turned down a high-paying gospel tour sponsored by a church organization in 1994, just because his name was on the poster. In a 1995 interview, when asked about the difference between artists singing about God and those truly living with God, Teddy replied, Not everyone who reads the Bible lives honestly. Some people use it to hide who they really are. Clifton continued preaching, but after 1996, he gradually withdrew from large conferences. No more TV shows, no more long tours. He focused on leading services at local churches, living more privately. In 2010, during a late-night interview on CBN, when asked about the unfair rumors he had faced, Clifton chuckled and said, "I've struggled with many things, but God knows I don't lie to him." That answer wasn't clear, but for Teddy Pendergrass, who had spent his life torn between sexuality, fame, and faith, ambiguity was just another form of deception that was hard to accept. These were 6 names, 6 times Teddy Pendergrass turned away without explanation. Just one misplaced joke, one prolonged glance, or one ambiguous sermon was enough for him to erase their names from the stage forever. No one was publicly condemned, but everyone knew they had crossed the line. So why did Teddy despise them? Because they were gay, because of the Abba desire, or because of the fear of being seen for who they really were? What do you think? Who among them deserved to be erased, and who was just a victim? Leave a comment below, and don't forget to follow the channel for the next names.